Hi, this is Rock. We're going to talk about the let function. Make no mistake about it, working in Excel, you are coding. This is computer code. The let function helps you be very graceful and intentional about the variables that you define and choose. So let's take a look. If I start typing let, what this is it gives you a way to give names to things, define variables basically, and then once you define the variables, you do something with them. What I have here is a set of data from October 19th, 2025. This is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA.gov, where what I did was I looked at the record-setting temperatures for this date, October 19th. So we have the station where the record was recorded, and then, of course, the 19th date. We have what the record was in Fahrenheit. We have the previous record date, and then the previous record, the number of years since that previous record was set, and then the difference between the previous record and this new record. What we're going to do is put together a formula that allows us to do a calculation to see what percentage difference is this difference. 0, obviously, that's going to be a 0% difference since it just tied the record. But this next one, basically, we want to be able to calculate 3 is what percent of 73 degrees. So let's start by using the let function to define some variables. We don't really need the station name here. And let me just go on the next row here. So I'm going to expand that and start my let function here. So the station will not matter here. So we can ignore that as setting that for a variable. This date I can set as, I'll call it event date. So what I'm doing here is I'm defining a variable, and then I'm saying what that variable is. It's this. And that whole column of dates, they're actually all the same date, but I'm going to go ahead and define them that way because if I want to use this same formula where I have different dates for when the record was set, this will still work the same way. When I'm using a let function, what I will do is use the Alt-Enter to do a carriage return. What I like to do is to have a name, which is a variable here, and then the value on the same line, and then do the next name and the next value on the next line. So we'll say what the record is, and I'm just making this up. I could have said event date. I could have said date of event. I'm just defining my own variables here. So I'm going to use record as the next variable, and here I'm going to define it by selecting it. I could have just typed that as well, but it's often easier to select. So then I have a comma there. So what I'm doing is building pairs of the variable and its definition, the next variable and its definition. The next variable I'm going to do is previous date, and I'm using an abbreviation here in my variable name. You have to be careful. If you abbreviate something too much, then somebody comes behind you and they're trying to understand how your formula works, and it may be hard for them to understand. But you also don't want to have very long variables. Part of the reason for using variables is to have things be concise and well defined. And obviously with a variable, you can't have any spaces in that variable name. So in lieu of having spaces, what I'll do is I'll capitalize words like date. When I want to say previous date, I'll capitalize the D. And now I'm going to define previous date by selecting this. I'm going to put a comma, Alt-Enter, and then previous record. So I'm going to say prev record, all one word there, and I'm going to select this. So that's my previous record. And then Alt-Enter the number of years. In this calculation where we're trying to see what the percentage is, I don't need the number of years, so I'm going to ignore that one here. But I do need to know the difference. So I'm just going to say diff and select this, as the fifth and final variable that I need. So that was the last variable I need for my calculation. I don't really even need event date and previous date for my percentages. But I would if what I wanted to do was have a calculation of the percentage change by year. So I've included it here for that reason. But I think in this example, we're just going to look at the percentage difference. So I'm going to hit Alt Enter again because the last thing that I need to do for this let is to do the calculation itself. Here's what we need to do for the calculation. We need to figure out what percent the difference is of the previous record. So what we're going to do here is just use regular math, but have our variables be put in there. So the math is the difference divided by the previous record. And you see, as I start to type here, it gives me choices from my own definitions here that I could select on here and have that enter in. So the difference divided by the previous record is our calculation. And if I close that let and hit enter, it's giving me a percentage of each of these. Now, for the ones that are 0, those are going to be tied, and you see the difference is 0. One thing that I can do here is I could come up here and just hit that percentage and maybe add a decimal to it. I'm going to put a heading here of percent difference. So to review, the let function lets you put in variables and their definitions in pairs. And then after you've made all those variable definitions, then you can use the variables here in some kind of calculation, which we've done here. I didn't need to put a return here, carriage return. I could have listed these all out like this, and that's perfectly fine. But I find for myself, I prefer to have this delineated visually on a different line so that I can easily see which are the variables, their definitions, and which is the calculation. And that's the let function. Next, we're going to look at name manager. See you then.